Logos and persuasion through the reasonableness of the text. Be sure to pause and rewind the video at any time to take notes and reflect. Logos is the kind of persuasion that's achieved through the reasonableness of the ideas the author presents in a text. When we analyze the logos of a text, we're looking at the specific arguments that are made. Using logical reasoning is perhaps the first thing we think of when we want to convince someone of something. That's because logic is universal. What is logically sound to you and me is supposed to be logically sound to everyone else. A rational audience just naturally finds sound arguments persuasive, and there are specific rules that govern what is and what is not rational. Let's go back to Aristotle. He defined two essential ways to argue. One through enthymeme, which is a conclusion supported by logical premises, and the other through example, which is a generalization supported by specific instances. Now, there are other ways that we can argue, but they essentially belong under one of those two defined ways that Aristotle gave. We could argue, for instance, through analogy, by drawing similarities between two things. We could argue by providing expert evidence, which is basically relying on what an expert says to draw our own conclusions or strengthen them. We could provide statistics and data using numbers and collected sets of data from which we can draw conclusions. And again, all of these things really just fall under those two original categories that Aristotle defined. All arguments are comprised of two parts, the claim and support. The claim is the idea that's being argued. It's whatever idea that the speaker is trying to prove to the audience. The support is whatever supporting idea or ideas which directly back up that claim. For instance, if I were to say Bernie Sanders is popular among millennials because his policies promote the redistribution of wealth and aggressive solutions toward climate change, the claim of this argument would be that Bernie Sanders is popular among millennials. That's the idea I'm trying to prove with the two different pieces of support that I provide, the two different ideas. One, that his policies promote the redistribution of wealth, and two, that his policies promote aggressive solutions toward climate change. Based on those two things, I'm saying that Bernie Sanders is popular among millennials. Here's another example. According to the latest poll numbers, Bernie Sanders is the most popular politician among millennials. This may not seem like an argument at first. It seems like just a statement of fact, but really there is actually an argument that I'm trying to communicate here. My claim is that Bernie Sanders is the most popular politician among millennials, and I'm backing that up with whatever polling data I have. Obviously, if I were trying to really convince someone of this idea, I would want to actually direct them to the poll or cite the actual numbers, because just telling an audience that the numbers exist is not very convincing. Still, this would be an example of an argument because I'm trying to prove a claim by providing specific support for that claim. Let's look more in depth at those different kind of arguments and at what the claim and support looks like in each one. In an argument through enthymeme, the author supports a claim through a series of logical statements. And the reasoning goes like this: if the logical statements provided are true, then the claim must be true as well. This is perhaps the most common type of argumentation that we have, is we find a series of ideas that if those ideas are true, they support a naturally following concluding idea. For instance, Bernie Sanders is popular among millennials because his policies promote the redistribution of wealth, which millennials overwhelmingly desire. Here I have a string of premises which support my claim. My claim is that Sanders is popular among millennials, and my support is that his policies promote the redistribution of wealth, and that supports my claim because of the other premise, that the redistribution of wealth is something that millennials overwhelmingly desire. Okay, so my claim is strong as long as the supporting premises are in fact true. Now, they are debatable. Some people might argue against them, but this is just an example of how a claim is supported through enthymeme. In an argument through example, the author supports a claim through a specific set of observed instances. And the existence of those instances are what suggests that the claim must be true. For instance, if I were to say thousands of millennials have shown up to each of Bernie Sanders' rallies, and more millennials volunteer for his campaign than for any other candidates, so he must be popular among millennials. Here, I'm arguing the same claim, but I'm not doing so through logical premises. Instead, I'm arguing through specific observed examples. The fact that thousands of millennials have shown up to each of his rallies. The fact that more millennials volunteer for his campaign than any others. These are things that have been observed. They're observed facts. And from that, I'm drawing the conclusion that he must be popular. Now, once again, the strength of my argument overall relies on how true my examples are and also the number of examples I provide. In any argument through example, you're trying to support a generalization about something, and any generalization grows in strength with the more examples you can provide. In an argument through analogy, the author supports a claim by comparing two things, reasoning that if this one thing is true, then this other thing like it must also be true. It's really just a complex form of enthymeme. Here's an example. The United States guarantees free education to each citizen, so why not free health care? Now, note that this is a question, and a question isn't perhaps the best way to state an argument, but there is an implied argument here. The implied argument is that the United States ought to guarantee its free citizens health care because it guarantees its citizens free education. And I'm relying on the logic of an analogy. I'm suggesting that free education is like free healthcare. Now, the logic I use to draw that comparison might need further exploration, but I'm essentially saying that these two things are similar enough that because we support one, we ought to support the other. In an argument through expert evidence, the author supports a claim through citing what experts have said, reasoning that if the expert is correct in their conclusion, then this argument must also be true. This is another kind of complex enthymeme. For instance, if I were to say Scottish economist Mark Blyth states in his 2013 book that economic austerity actually harms a nation's economy, so the United States should not be cutting social programs to grow its economy, here I'm relying on the conclusions of an expert economist, Mark Blyth. And I'm saying that if his conclusions are true, then that is supporting the claim that I'm making, which is that the United States should not be cutting social programs, which is a form of austerity. Finally, an argument through statistics and data is where the author supports a claim by citing gathered or collected data of some kind. It draws its conclusions from those numbers. It's really just a specific way to argue through example. It's just that the observed instances are gathered in data sets, really. Here's an example. Last year, corporations used over 90% of their new tax breaks on stock buybacks and spent virtually nothing to raise the salaries of their workers. The tax break, therefore, did little to help average Americans. Here I'm citing a statistic that 90% of that money they were able to save from the tax breaks went directly into buying back their stocks, which enriches their stock prices and makes their company more valuable on the markets. And very little of that, by logic, there's only 10% left, so that's all that went to raise the salaries of their workers. So based on the numbers, I'm concluding that the tax breaks did little to help average Americans. Note again, this is just a more specific way to argue through example. It's basically just example through collected data. Whenever you examine the logos of a persuasive text, you need to pick out the specific arguments that the author makes. You should examine the primary argument, which is the overall argument the speaker is making, which you might call his or her thesis. And you need to also look at all the supporting arguments that the speaker makes that are helping support that thesis. You also need to be able to paraphrase the claim and support of these arguments, because just as you saw in some of my examples, sometimes the claim and support aren't stated plainly. They're not so easy to just pick out. Sometimes the claim and or support will be implied, and so you have to be able to paraphrase that this is the speaker's claim and this is the support they offer. Finally, you need to analyze why the author is using that particular argument or type of argument. Why are they using those arguments and not others? Why are they using those kinds of arguments and not others? What is it about the rhetorical situation or the rhetorical constraints they're facing that might be dictating the types of arguments and the specific reasoning they use? Let's think back to Fred Rogers' testimony. What is his primary argument? Well, his primary claim, you might call this his thesis, is that the budget for PBS should not be preserved and should not be cut. And the support for that claim is that the kind of children's programming PBS provides, like his show, helps children's emotional development. And that's something that they just aren't getting anywhere else. He makes a series of supporting arguments throughout his testimony to back up this primary argument. At one point, he talks about how inexpensive his program is compared to cartoons, supporting the idea that his program is a bargain. He also argues that his program is effective because of his specific expertise in child development, which argues that he is a trusted source for this kind of children's programming. He also argues that his program can ultimately help people learn to solve their disputes non-violently. He talks specifically about the amount of violence and gun violence specifically seen on TV, and he says that if his program can teach two men to settle their disputes without resorting to violence, then that would ultimately help the mental health status in the United States. Now, these are all strategic arguments. For one, no senator would deny something vital to the development of children. That's why his overall argument is that his program provides this emotional education, this emotional development for children that they aren't getting anywhere else. Okay? The senators can't possibly deny that because they have a sworn responsibility to protect the public and act in the public's best interest. And the children are the most vulnerable members of a society. And so why would they deny something that is argued as vital to their development? Another thing that's strategic about his arguments is that the senators are deeply concerned with saving money. Remember, this is a time of recession. They've been ordered by the budget office to find cuts in the federal budget, and so that's why they're trying to cut PBS's budget in the first place. So they're concerned with saving money. So Fred Rogers' argument that his show is actually a bargain compared to a lot of other children's programming is really quite brilliant. Another thing here is that most children's programming at this time would have been animated cartoons, which are created by entertainment companies. And so to separate himself from those entertainment companies who are really just out for maximizing profit through advertising, he points out that he is actually an expert in child psychological development. And so that distinguishes him from these other companies. Lastly, we need to understand that this is 1969, the height of the Vietnam conflict. The news every day is full of reports of violence and the rising death toll over in Vietnam and Cambodia and elsewhere. And so his argument that his program can actually teach people to solve problems non-violently speaks to a public problem. Sure, he's not going to end the Vietnam War with his little program, but it still speaks to a problem that is at the forefront of the public's attention. So all of these reasons, all of this reasoning, all of these arguments he makes are dictated again by the rhetorical situation, and they're all strategic. Now, you might be thinking to yourself at this point that one of those arguments I mentioned a little while back sounds a lot like an ethos appeal, when he argues that he is a trustworthy source to develop children's programming because he's an expert in child psychology. We talked about that in a previous lesson as an appeal to ethos. Well, guess what? It's also an appeal to logos. Here's how that works. He is making an argument, which is an appeal to logos, and the result of that argument is ultimately helping him build his ethos. And so this is how the three rhetorical appeals kind of work together and work off of one another. Oftentimes you'll see speakers making arguments for other purposes, not just to support their primary argument, but also to support their character through ethos, and also to stir specific emotions through pathos. Just like ethos, there are rhetorical constraints that shape an author's logos techniques. There are logos obstacles. And these are when the audience may not know anything about the particular subject matter, or the audience may have some wrong misconceptions about the subject matter, or the audience may hold opposite opinions altogether. They may have opposite arguments that they would make to the speaker. So these are all things that are getting in the speaker's way when they make their arguments. There are also logos advantages. The audience may share some common understanding about the subject matter. The audience may hold some fixed belief about the subject matter, such as when Rogers was relying on the senators feeling a deep responsibility toward helping children. That was something that was advantageous to the arguments he designed. Finally, logos expectations. They're what you think. There are certain situations just call for different kinds of arguments and reasoning. You know, for instance, if you're writing an academic paper, you need to provide tons of researched examples and data. However, if you're giving a public speech to a non-academic audience, that kind of research data and examples might go over their heads, and it's really just not necessary. In a public speech, if you're addressing some issue in society, you probably want to start by arguing or by addressing some of the counter arguments. What are the opponents saying about this? And again, there's a lot of different ways that you address those logos expectations, but we just need to think about what the situation calls for, what would naturally be expected by the arguments the speaker provides. Let's think back to Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech. What are some of the logos obstacles he was facing when he delivered this speech? Well, for one, prejudice toward black people had existed for a long time in America, dating all the way back to the slave trade, which goes all the way back to the late 17th century. And so many Americans, anytime we see a problem that's gone on for so long, we tend to believe that it's just this inevitable thing that cannot be fixed. And there were even some people, racists, who believed that black people were inherently inferior. So they have these opposing arguments or misconceptions that he needs to straighten out. So a lot of his arguments deal with that. He argues through numerous logical premises the wrongness of these kinds of beliefs. He even refutes some of the common arguments that are made against him. Again, acknowledging what the audience thinks about the issue and then tailoring his arguments to overcome that thinking. What about some of the logos advantages he was dealing with? Well, people, just humanity in general, we have an innate sense of justice and fairness. We just kind of innately know what is fair and what is just. Also, most people have an innate sense of empathy towards others. Again, there were some in his audience who were, racist and bigoted, and they wouldn't have the same empathy toward black people. But for the most part, people have that innate empathy toward others. So how does he use this? Well, he relies on it. He relies on these fixed assumptions about the basic rights that we all share to make his arguments. He even quotes from the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal, a document that his audience would have been very familiar with and whose ideals they would all appreciate and share. Lastly, let's look at the logos expectations that King was facing in his arguments. First of all, he's delivering a speech at a protest rally. He's not in an academic lecture hall. He's delivering a speech to the public broadcast on television. Also, again, he's known as a Baptist minister. He's not some expert in sociology or a historian or anything like that. So he tailors his arguments to this. He relies on very simple enthymemes that are grounded in assumptions about basic equality. And he doesn't cite statistics like a sociologist would, or historical examples like a historian. He's not out there trying to, argue that doing these things, treating black people with respect and dignity, would better the economy or improve foreign relations. No, he's not giving those arguments. He's instead arguing from a place of morality and ethics, which, that fits who he is as a Baptist minister. So remember, the logos of a persuasive text is just the arguments that text makes. Without arguments, a persuasive text is really just a bunch of manipulation, and intelligent audiences will immediately recognize this and tune it out. That's the end of this video. Go ahead and move on to complete the corresponding assignment.